It's also quite true because of the cultural environment that we live in. If women are being taught, as they are, that from a very young age, men do not have their best intentions in mind, that they should always have their guard up against men, that they live in a patriarchy that's only seeking to oppress them, then why should women take the advice off of men who, in their minds, only want to cause them harm?
Well, obviously the bridge has been burned, but it must be built back from both sides.
Absolutely. And one of the interesting things is that I think you could accuse Perry of being a feminist man-hater from certain readings of this book, which I wouldn't agree with, but purely because she is pointing out the obvious differences, biological and psychological, between men and women, and how in a lot of encounters, men do have a physical upper hand that can cause them, that can allow them to put pressure on women to do things that they otherwise wouldn't. And I wouldn't say that that's man-hating, but I just want to
I think to draw the distinction that I'm sure Perry would be happy with, and she actually retweeted the link to this book club, so thank you for the promotion.
Hope you're watching.
Yeah, I think she draws a distinction between men's capacity for violence and their moral
duty.
Not even duty. It's whether or not they're morally culpable for exercising it, and that's the Jordan Peterson distinction, right? Of you don't want to be meek and ignorant. You want to understand the psychology of monsters. You want to have the propensity to act like a monster and then exercise restraint. And she's saying you must, as a man, be completely aware of your capacity for sexual variety, promiscuity, violence in certain contexts, and women should also be aware of that. And you should, as men, exercise restraint. As women, pick your mates accordingly in order to have a healthy and fulfilling relationship.
Yeah, of course. I mean, for one, more than anything, meek, pathetic, weak men do not attract women, or at least not high-value women.
She has this phrase in there that's it's basically she's describing the ick that a lot of girls...
the ick factor?
Yeah, that a lot of girls have said about. And it's something like there is not a word in the English language that actually describes the sensation that women get when they're in the presence of a man who they do not want to sleep with, but definitely wants to sleep with them. And it was... I'm just trying to find it.
That's an interesting thing as well, is that I found this useful reading these perspectives from a woman, and most especially reading them from a woman who is not being hysterical about it, who is not trying to tar all men with the same brush and say that men are inherently evil. She's pointing to the clearly observable fact of reality that there are, and I've seen this many times, and that's one of the reasons that I've found that this book has been so effective in speaking to me, is that sadly, given the circles that I have travelled throughout my years, I have encountered many of the men and women in similar scenarios that Louise Perry is talking about throughout this book. Men who are taking advantage of the sexual liberation narrative so that they are able to easily get their way with women who otherwise would not be interested in them. Oftentimes, and I've seen it happen firsthand, oftentimes by throwing out the, oh, you're a bit of a prude, oh, don't you want to be fun like the other girls, everybody else is doing this is just what we're living in right now, we're sexually liberated, this is just what you're supposed to do, as if it's a very positive thing, as if it's something beneficial for the women, when very, very obviously it is something done entirely for the benefit of the man who just wants to get an easy shag.
That's strange because, it's not strange because it's a pretty common story, but for me it's often been quite inverted. So I've met guys who exploited the sexual liberation landscape. So there was a couple of guys that I went to drink with at university, and they were pretty upstanding to their mates. But then they would sleep around a hell of a lot, and they even had like a tally chart in their house for who had the most.
That's
cringeworthy.
That's so cringe. I've seen the same thing, but it's very cringe.
They're now in relationships because I spent most of the time at pre-drinks being the Christian apologist moralizer that I am, always fun at parties. But I was sitting there going, well, look, lads, when you actually want to settle down, you're just poisoning the well for everyone else. And what you're doing is you can complain about the resentful feminists all you like, but by scorning these women, leaving them out in the cold, promising them the world just for a one-night stand, you're strapping them up as like an emotional suicide bomber and sending them off into some other guy's life. Now, do you want that to happen to you? No. Universalize your sexual ethics so that no other man gets screwed over and so that you don't make bitter, miserable women. And Perry makes the same case here for saying, women, choose your mates carefully because you don't want to put yourself in a precarious situation. It's nice to have the other side of the argument made in women's interests because it's hard to pierce the gynocentric veil of feminism that they've erected over the last 50-odd years.
It is, and Once again, interestingly, I think I learned something about myself reading this book as well, because she often goes over the differences in the factor known as sociosexuality between men and women. There's the two bell curves that kind of overlap, but overwhelmingly those with low sociosexuality, which means, for those uninitiated, that you are much less interested in casual sex. You're probably more interested in a long-term, stable, monogamous relationship.
Commitment over variety.
Yes, these people are overwhelmingly women, whereas those high in sociosexuality are overwhelmingly men. And I think that I've determined that I might actually be one of the rare men who's very low in sociosexuality.
And it's funny because I've encountered lots of women who are on the higher end of
absolutely, so have I. Although I would say that a lot of the women that I've encountered on the higher end of the spectrum would not have naturally fallen into that area of the spectrum outside of certain pressures that society has put on them. And I don't want this whole thing to turn into, oh, it's society's fault that people behave this way, because obviously people still have personal agency, they still have control over their actions. But I think it is very naive to, in a purely individualistic sense, ignore the effect and pressures that outside and external factors
in my experience, I think it's a bit of a blend of both, because I've encountered women who might be higher on the sociosexuality spectrum, but also might have been indoctrinated into the cult of sexual bacchanalia for your own girl boss liberation. And much like the postmodernists charge every philosophy with servicing only the ambitions of the philosopher, they have adopted what Perry talks about in here later on, about the articles about not catching feelings, treating emotions like a disease. They've adopted that mindset and often actually use sex to secure a man's interest, and then just disregard the relationship because they say, "Oh, I'm emotionally unavailable," or "I can't catch feelings right now." And it's a very sad state of being to be, where women think,
in fact, when we get
emotions
to it,
are alien.
When we get to it later in the book, in the chapters, it is very clear that women have kind of been taught to separate their natural feelings that come from intimate and personal relationships from what's expected of them. You're not expected to get married young, you're not expected to be interested in children anymore, you're not expected to do any of these things that traditionally have worked very well for women, both from a purely physical sense of providing them with safety and security, that being a well-off, high-status man to provide material comfort for them, and also psychologically, which is just the fact of the matter is most women are looking for a stable, emotionally secure relationship where they can trust. And this is something that I find interesting that I've learnt about before, which is evolutionary psychology has kind of dictated that men are much more prone to being insecure about physical infidelity, because obviously you want to make sure that your children are yours. If your woman's sleeping around, there might be a chance that you've basically been cuckooed and you're raising somebody else's children. Women, because of the need for security from the man, are much more insecure about emotional infidelity. Like, this is why so many women can be in relationships with a man who's cheated on them, but as long as they're secure in the idea that it was a purely physical fling, there was no emotion involved in it, they can kind of set that aside, compartmentalize it slightly. Whereas if it's a more emotional fling that was taken, that will hurt them much more.
And this is what, like, things like porn addiction can destroy relationships, because the woman is always going to be afraid that you're mentally committing to whatever screen whore you choose to look at that day.
And the fact of the matter is, a lot of men do sadly fall into that trap nowadays. It's not something that women are wrong about worrying about.
No, and they're sensitive to it for a reason. And it seems that Perry actually has some interesting conclusions and suggestions to draw from.
Just before we go fully into the chapters, I will say as well, I really did enjoy how, despite the fact that Perry is quite adamant that, as far as I can tell, that she's not a conservative, that she's not a right-winger.
That she's still a feminist.
That she is still a feminist. The conclusions that she draws from this are very traditionally minded, almost reactionary, I would say.
I think she can no longer label herself a feminist unless she's trying to reclaim the word, but I think it's a dead label, precisely because, and we'll get onto some critiques towards the end, I think, because you wholeheartedly enjoyed this book. I
know you had more issues with it.
Well, no, I by the time I'd finished, the opening couple of chapters, I had issues with the premises in which the arguments were grounded, and we'll go to those. Towards the end, she's still trying to cling to the feminist label, but she has a classification error as to what the feminists actually intended, because she seems to impart benevolent intent on behalf of many of the feminists, including Kate Millett and de Beauvoir, when they openly said, we want to abolish patriarchy, property, and parenthood. And it's like, it's the feminist project for atomizing women from their children and families was not a bug, it's a feature.
And of course, just divorcing them from the psychological reality of how women operate as well.
Yeah, well, Beauvoir literally said, whether it's you or Carl that wants to go through this with me, but we'll cover the second sex at some point, which is horrific.
I'm not reading the second
I
sex.
don't blame you, it's 1,500 pages, the worst thing I've ever read, but Beauvoir actually says, women are more likely to believe a story in a drawing room or a line at a supermarket than they are a scientific study, and therefore rationality in the hands of men is a tool for violence. And then if you check her sources, it's mainly random stories and case studies pulled from psychoanalytic journals and books, which means that she is admitting that she thinks women are only manipulated by stories and they're subjective creatures, and so she's using stories to convince you to no longer have kids and only be a worker drone.
That's an interesting thing, is that this isn't something that's only peculiar to women. This is something that is that I've been reading De Jouvenel on power recently, which is a fantastic read, and I would recommend anybody read it. I might do a book club about it later, but I just got to page 88 of that, and he's talking about how power shifts throughout the years and how people, different civilizations have conceptualized and rationalized power. And he has a quote here that I find very, very applicable to this, which is, our modes of feeling are much more stubborn things than our modes of thinking, in regards to the way that we try and rationalize things, but at the end of the day, that's still not going to change how you feel inside.
Yeah, it's Ben Shapiro's argument of facts don't care about your feelings. Well, unfortunately, feelings will not care about your facts, so you have to
You can't shift
confront people on both
someone's
fronts.
deeply entrenched feelings with facts.
No, and that's why actually Perry's book is a pretty solid argument against this.
I'm very much in the camp of you need to provide somebody with the information with which they can change their own mind.
Yeah, but it's also, she's speaking the language of femininity and acting your preferential interests, so she's already getting the audience on side, despite her thinking that many of her statements are controversial. They're ultimately not. It's just we've been distanced from our natural instincts, and hopefully she breaks through that cold, rational, ideological wall that has severed women from their emotional reality.
That's the benefit of it coming from a woman. I've been reading passages of this to my missus at home while I've been going through it, and she's just been immediately on board with the things that have been said and just gone, well, I hadn't considered it like that. I hadn't thought of it like that before, which to me shows the utility. And in fact, I have actually bought a physical copy of it for her so that she can read through it.
I recommend do get a physical copy. There's a link in the description, but I thoroughly enjoyed reading it on my train journeys into work, and on holiday as well.
It's very, very easy read, nice breezy writing style. It's not written for academics, it's written for human beings who want to understand the information being conveyed to them.
Thomas will be offended by your distinction between academics and human beings.
Listen. Okay.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.